Kia ora koutou te whānau. Thanks for joining us today. We're here live with Charles Eisenstein, and really honored to have you with us today on the program, Charles. And Charles is joining us from Rhode Island, the east coast of the United States. What time is it there, Charles?
7 o'clock.
7 o'clock. Okay, so that was your dinner you were having before, huh?
Yeah, it was.
And we're coming at you from Whaingaroa in Raglan, New Zealand, and it's a bit of a storm outside today. So we're hoping that it's not going to filter in too much to the microphone. But yeah, we're really getting the winter storms joining us now. So to start, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to Earthspeed and how the series came about. So we're an organization that started in 2014 with a group of friends coming together, and the purpose that we came up with was to create a platform for transformation and celebration to inspire and empower new ways of living. So that's a purpose that's been alive for us, and we were primarily an event organization for the last 5 years, but it's also a passion of ours to hold a platform, hold a space for more immersive learning to take place as well, which is something that we're exploring for future events and the evolution of the organization as a whole. So this series started when we had to cancel the event 4 days before the gates opened. And that left us in a place where we really wanted to explore what was going on in the world and from different perspectives, and also offer a place where we can share that. And a lot of the people that have inspired us as a crew we've been fortunate to have them join us on the series. So I'll just quickly talk about questions as well. We'd like to get your input and questions, and they could come at any time. We'll be looking at questions throughout the session and bringing them up when it feels right, but there will be a time at the end as well that we will directly look at your questions. So if you do have any questions that come up during the session, write them in the Q&A, and if you're on Facebook, write them in the comments, and we can also bring people in live for questions as well. So that's an option as well, and maybe just put it in the comments that you'd like to come on live and have a conversation and ask Charles your question in person. Yeah, without further ado, I'll introduce Charles. And Charles, I've been following your work for a while, and I don't know if you remember, but a few years back when you were in New Zealand, I don't know how you got my number, but you gave me a call and you were in Auckland, and you were like, hey, a friend of mine gave me your number and I'm looking for a place to stay. And at the time I just landed as well, so I was in the same situation. I couldn't really help you out, but yeah, we've crossed paths on a few occasions, and always been yeah, very inspired by the perspective that you bring, and what it creates around it, from different critiques and how people accept it, and just the dialogue that it creates around it. So been very appreciative of that. So I'll hand it over to you to give a little bit more background around what you do and what's alive in the world of Charles Eisenstein right now. Yeah, so away you go.
Sure. Usually I describe myself as a writer. I've been writing books and essays for 15 or 20 years. And And then over the last maybe the last 10 years, increasingly I became a public speaker and went to, New Zealand, went all over the place, speaking on a lot of topics revolving around the transition in civilizations defining stories and myths, what that undergird our systems, our ways of thinking, our ways of seeing, money, politics, technology, science, religion, medicine, education, et cetera, and pointing out that the transitions in all of these realms share a common root and are part of a larger transition in human beingness. And so, yeah, I've been doing that for a number of years, and now times have changed and I'm not traveling anymore. And part of me is quite pleased with this development, um, in a very selfish way, you know, understanding, of course, the devastation that COVID-19 and the response to it has caused. But for me, it's been quite a watershed. And so now I'm online a lot, doing things like this and exploring what that makes possible and what it forecloses as well. So I don't know what else you want to know about me. I have 4 children, four sons. Eldest is 24, youngest is 7. And almost my only material skill is that I'm a pretty good cook.
So you've it's been likely like myself. I've got 2 little boys, and really appreciated this time being at home. And it's been that way for you too, I'd assume.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's been quite a gift
How did
in certain ways.
Yeah, how did you get into writing?
Oh
Was it like
boy.
a formal? Did you like was it a kind of like a formal avenue, or was it just you just started writing?
I had a series of realizations and insights that compelled me to write them. I never aspired to be a writer. Uh, I didn't have an ambition to be a writer, but there was nothing else I could do with the ideas that had seized me. And mixed in with that, I guess, once I knew that I had to do this, then I also started to get delusions of grandeur. Uh, imagining that maybe I would be someday very famous and very wealthy, and that my book that I spent 4 years writing would be a bestseller and catapult me to the ranks of the intellectual elite. Of course, nothing of the sort happened. That 4-year effort was followed by bankruptcy and getting a job as a construction worker and being in poverty with my children as a single dad. So it didn't quite turn out the way that I expected or that I hoped. And that experience really was a way of the universe asking me, what's the real reason you're doing this? And do you want to continue doing it, knowing that you're not going to receive any of the things that you had hoped for? Or with at least with no guarantee that I would ever receive any of the things I hoped for. So that experience led me to come into contact with deeper and truer motivations that had they'd been there from the start, but you get a great idea and then pretty soon the ego takes over and tries to make something out of it other than what it really is or wants to be. So yeah, that's just a little bit of my background. And then, strangely enough, when I really gave up on that ambition, then things started to flow a lot more. And I wouldn't say that I'm, a first-rate public intellectual, but maybe second or third rate, and definitely speaking to a certain segment of our culture, a certain subculture that seems to be growing and changing a lot in these times.
Thanks for sharing that. So, I mean, one of the recent essays of yours that I read that got me thinking, and through sending it to people, just so that you're aware, I've also been bombarded with numerous critiques of it as well. So it's been a
Oh
nice,
yeah.
it's been a good journey to a very thought provoking journey to hear the discussion about the coronation, which was your essay. I think it was released in March, on the
Mm-hmm.
30th of March. Um, I think in that essay, personally, I felt like some of the things that I was feeling at the time were expressed in terms of the level of certainty around that people seemed to have at the time around what was going on in the world. And yeah, so it was a fresh perspective. Can you give us a little, I guess, an overview of that thinking, and even perhaps how it's changed since then? And
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, some of what I said in there might be out of date, and a lot of it seems to be more relevant than ever, especially the part about how we may never have certainty about what COVID actually was and what happened and what we should do or should have done about it. Even today, in our highly polarized pu public discourse, we have profound disagreement on these questions. That doesn't seem to be dissipating with time. I mean, it seems that each side is able to select the data points that confirm its own beliefs, and each side, has a box for the other side uh, in which they are, ignorant and immoral and stupid and not evidence-based and so forth. Um, so when I face a situation like that where I'm confronted with mutually contradictory and, in their own terms, fairly compelling narratives, I always look, instead of saying, okay, which one's right and which one's wrong, I look at what truths does each express, what might be a larger container that can hold them both, what do both sides neglect to even talk about by framing the issue in this way? What are the hidden agreements that unconsciously unite both sides? Um, so the essay has a lot of that kind of stuff. Like, for example, one thing that is lost in the epidemiological arguments about case fatality rates and benefits versus harms of lockdown from a medical perspective. One thing that gets lost there is, should we make our personal and collective decisions primarily on the basis of safety, or on the basis of risk minimization, or on the basis of saving lives? What other values does that exclude? Values like living well, living fully. Um, what is the role of risk in our lives? And when do we, on purpose, do things that are riskier from the perspective of lifespan, life expectancy or safety, that are bring some other benefits. So I wrote about these conflicting values and why risk minimization and life prolongation is such a high priority in Western civilization, and it has to do with the denial of death, basically the mania for youthfulness, the hiding away of old people in nursing homes, for example. Um, the euphemisms even by which we hide death. And so that's one of the themes in there. Another theme was what I call the program of control and the civilizational tilt toward control-based solutions, where our comfort and familiarity is with problems that can be resolved by dominating, eliminating, killing, conquering, or controlling the causal agent. So one example would be to try to solve crime by locking up the criminals, or end terrorism by killing the terrorists, or resolve immigration by keeping out the immigrants, or cure disease by finding the pathogen and destroying that pathogen, or quarantining and locking down. So this kind of response is in our comfort zone because there's an identifiable enemy and we know what to do. There's something to fight. Whereas what I said in the essay is the true pandemic of our time, the most serious epidemic health condition of our time is undoubtedly autoimmunity, which afflicts, especially in the developed world, which afflicts hundreds of millions of people, orders of magnitude more prevalent than it was 2 generations ago. I was just on a call with a medical doctor who pointed out that childhood chronic conditions had about a 1% prevalence rate in 1980. Things like diabetes, autism, allergies, autoimmune conditions, et cetera. And now they have a 52% prevalence rate. And he said, you know, we wonder why this is happening. And I thought, I wish we wondered why, but it seems that it's kind of taken for granted. There's no uproar, there's no clamor, there's no urgency, there's no, oh my God, we've got to do something about this. It's just kind of taken for granted. Why? It's because these conditions, especially autoimmunity, do not succumb to that solution template of finding the bad thing, the bad guy, the causal agent, the one thing that we can identify through reductionistic analysis and control. These are caused by who knows, they're part of a complex that includes our own way of life. It's not an external thing that we can fight or kill or destroy or control. So we kind of don't pay attention to that. And then comes COVID, and finally, here's something that we can go to war against. Here's something that the technologies of control, of contact tracing, of lockdown, of social distancing can effectively combat. And so it's like we've been waiting for something like this. So we have this extreme response that very arguably is doing more harm than good. If you include the people on this earth who usually get excluded and are getting excluded in our considerations today, the people of Africa, South Asia, Latin America, who are starving by the tens of millions right now because of the consequences of lockdown. Like, isn't it time that we start to include the Black and brown people of this earth in our considerations of what is of the social benefit? So there's considerations like that I also wanted to bring into the conversation, and not to, and I guess a deeper danger is to make our decisions based on metrics, based on quantities, based on data all the time that leaves out the unmeasurable and the qualitative. So it's easy to quantify life expectancy or case fatality rates or things like that. It's a lot harder to quantify things like domestic violence that is surging under lockdown, or mental health, fulfillment, happiness, the kind of benefit you get from sociality. And I guess, I don't know, I could, like, it was a 9,000 word essay. I'm not sure if you want me to keep going on and on about
Oh no, I
all of,
mean you've already covered a lot there.
yeah.
I mean with regards to safety, because yeah, as a parent, that's obviously something that is at the forefront for us in terms of safety, both at home and in other areas of our lives. But is it do you see it as necessarily mutually exclusive? Like, can you be adventurous and playful and be like I'm just challenging you a little bit there in terms of like, yeah,
It's
like
not either or. It's not either or. Nobody's saying, safety is an illegitimate value and we shouldn't care about safety. What I'm saying is that, yeah, like some of these critiques, like I read them, I'm like, wow, I never realized what a bad person I was. And, wow, I never realized that I was a right-wing Trump supporting conspiracy theorist. Gosh, um, it's news to me. But anyway, so this is part of our political culture. Things get painted in black and white.
yeah,
So I'm not saying, and I was pretty careful, I thought, to say this is not about safety versus freedom or something like that. This is about conflicting values, and each of these values have their legitimacy. Um, it's just that none of these values should automatically trump every other value without a conversation. Obviously, if we were facing like something on the scale of the bubonic plague with a 50% death rate, there'd be no question. We would all be distancing and quarantining very strictly. If it is, suppose it were something that was only going to kill one person, if we don't lock down, we wouldn't lock down then. We'd say, sorry, one person, but we're going to have to put you at risk because we're not going to change everything. So COVID is somewhere in the middle there, isn't it? So it's not clear cut what we should do. We have to recognize that there are conflicting values and bring them all onto the table. Whereas the tendency of our culture is and has been over many decades to make safety and security more and more and more important relative to other values. More and more things aren't allowed. The consciousness of liability, like you're going to get sued, that is growing and growing, and that's another consequence of this fixation on safety. And child rearing too. Like the things that I was allowed to do as a kid would get parents a visit from Child Protective Services today, roaming for miles around, unsupervised in nature. Like I know parents who have been, who've had their kids taken away for letting their kids do what was universal in my childhood. And if you go back more generations, I mean, children were much more trusted to take care of themselves. And yeah, maybe they did meet with an accident sometimes, but it was understood that if you don't have the opportunity to engage the risks of the world, you will never learn how to take care of yourself. We need risk, we need challenge. So with my kids, like, I would give them a knife when they're 3 years old. And I remember this with one of them. I'm like, Matthew, this knife is sharp. If you're not careful, you could cut yourself. Well, guess what happened? He wasn't careful and he cut himself and it hurt and there was blood. And what he learned from that was, first, knives are sharp and dangerous. Second, he learned, Dad's pretty smart. Maybe I should listen to him. Whereas if I had forbidden him to use it and punished him if he touched it, what he would have learned is that Dad is dangerous, not that knives are dangerous, and that he is not capable. And then one day when he finally does pick up a knife and probably doesn't hurt himself, then he learns that Dad's pretty stupid too. So imagine when they become a teenager and and I'm exaggerating here, but the only danger that they faced is getting in trouble. And now teenagers, being much smarter than adults, can evade all of your control measures. So they're no longer going to get in trouble. And they haven't learned through the school of hard knocks that the world itself is dangerous. Then they end up taking horrible risks and acting as if as they have been seen, which is as not trustworthy and not capable. So this is just like, I mean, I've spun this out quite far, but this is just one facet of our culture's uh, uh, evolution toward more fear. And in the essay, I was pointing to that. And I'm not saying, you know, forget safety, you know, and forget taking care of each other or anything like that. I'm just like, can we please have a conversation about these competing values?
Right. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate the perspective of the um, of something to fight against, and being able to deploy all this technology and all these techniques to combat a virus through different ways of locking down, and whether it was the right or wrong thing to do or whatever, you know, wherever you stand on that. It seemed like a good place to experiment anyway. And well, maybe not experiment isn't the right word, but a good place to a good opportunity to test a lot of things that are available to us, which also, yeah, but it takes me to the next next question around the well, one of the things that has been alive for us, and even on the series with past speakers, is being able to discern or collect or absorb information, and how we can do the due diligence to take political action, to take some sort of position or stance, or whether, you know, whether it's even I mean, whether it's even necessary or not is another conversation, and there is a lot to say about that. But if like we're in an election year in New Zealand, and yeah, that question of what level of epistemological literacy do we need to have, and how do we develop that, and uh, how do we really know what's going on? So if we are to take, if we do want to take political action, if we do, but which inevitably in our world is taking a side on something. And that's kind of roughly where it stands. I mean, there's other avenues to explore that I'm interested to hear from you, if there are, yeah, what your thinking is around it. But yeah, and overall, just how do we know things, like, you know, like, in that, and because it seems on one level it's it's I mean, I'm very accepting of the idea that it's important to be like, there was a quote that I read that intelligence isn't knowing things, it's the ability to challenge what you know, or stay open to challenge what you know. And I really adhere to that. But you know, for some people in my life, it's been quite challenging for them to let go of that external reference point, and like, and just I guess yeah, have found it quite scary in terms of being able to uh, unattach themselves from certain ethical or moral beliefs that um, may be evolving or may be changing over time. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, curious to hear what your thoughts are on
Yeah.
that long question. And we have a number of different questions coming on from some of our viewers as well, both on Facebook, and got one of our brothers, Leo, which has a number of questions, and I'm sure he'd like to join the conversation. So we'll bring him into the chat room, and he can jam with you as well. But I'll leave you with that question for now.
Yeah. Boy, I mean, I could say a lot about that. Maybe I'll start by observing that here's something that both sides of the political spectrum, both people of both parties share in common, and this is true in most countries that I know about anyway. They're both pretty sure that they're right and that the other side is intellectually and morally deficient compared to themselves. Because otherwise, how could you deny the truth if you're not either evil or stupid or close-minded or whatever psychological epithet you want to apply to the other side? Like they must not be as fully human as ourselves, because we are right. Look, I mean, it's obvious. Here's the facts. Here's the evidence. Here's the logic. Here's the authorities backing us up. This is scientific. This is objective. And the other side is lost in delusion. Both sides share that view. And I think that both sides are actually wrong. And that, and I would maybe even say all sides, and I would include myself in that as well. Probably every person listening to this is wrong about some piece of knowledge that they hold so dearly that they think it is undisputable reality. And unless you think that you're the smartest guy in the world, that's probably true of you. So the question is, what will it take for you to release that belief? Where does that humility come from? What we are seeing today with the paralysis of our society is that we are locked in these frozen debates that obscure deeper issues through their smoke and clamor, through their drama. We get so fixated on these rather narrow debates whose very framing prevents a deeper consideration of underlying issues, that we never pay attention to those underlying issues. So I mean, to take an extreme analogy or an allegory even, imagine that we're all locked in prison and all of our labor is being exploited by the warden, and now it's time for the election of the prison mascot, and two possibilities are offered to us, and one of them you think is slightly better and it's going to improve conditions in the prison a little bit. Another one other people think is better, and we get into this furious uproar and debate around this issue. Meanwhile, the fundamental operations of the prison proceed untouched. And this is kind of the situation that we're in. Nobody's like, you know, in my country, there's tremendous furor right now about racial injustice and police brutality and white privilege and all of that. And I'm not saying that this is an unimportant issue, but I also look at what and who is getting left out when we frame the debate in this way. And one of the things is the hundreds of millions or billions of people who are being crushed by the international debt system. Most of these are, again, people in black and brown people in the global South, whose national and personal wealth is getting siphoned off to make payments on international debt. That is just totally not even part of the conversation. So, and I could give examples in many fields where this is the case. So a lot of times when we talk about political involvement, we need to ask, what exactly are we getting involved in, and what by default are we not getting involved in when we enter into this particular debate, into this particular fight? What is nobody paying attention to? And when we learn about that, then the call to attention changes. And maybe we still do get involved in electoral politics. Maybe we bring some of this awareness into electoral politics. I'm not wanting to invalidate that as a path, but there's other work to be done to um, create systems change and narrative change, and a change of consciousness, a change of our perceptions, the way that we narrate the world to each other and to ourselves. Like this work, this is the foundation of our political system. So that's a little bit of what I would say in answer to that. Hope it wasn't too theoretical, but
No, thanks for that. That's yeah, I appreciate that that acknowledging what is being left out of the conversation. And it's so easy uh to just take that as for granted, that this is what this is about and that's all I need to focus on.
right.
So it's yeah, thanks for opening that up.
Or like with COVID, let me just add one mini thing. Like with COVID, there's this whole debate about hydroxychloroquine, and if you like it, then you're supporting Trump, and there's this research and that research, yada, 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 this whole debate. Well, what's getting left out of that? Like, how about Chinese herbal medicine and its marked success in preventing and treating COVID-19? Where are the hundreds of millions of dollars being spent on studying that? Or on Artemisia annua, which is being used all over Africa, a traditional treatment for malaria that seems to be working really well for COVID-19. What about the Stephen Buhner protocol, herbal protocol for preventing and treating COVID-19? Where are the tens of millions spent on that? Like, that's not even part of the conversation. By even choosing to make it about remdesivir and hydroxychloroquine and intravenous vitamin C or whatever, like, you're already narrowing the conversation, and in my view, leaving out a bigger picture that this coronavirus, the essay was called The Coronation because I saw it as an initiation into a new sovereignty. Sovereignty is choice. It's to make choices that were unconscious before. It's to become more of a sovereign over your life. And I meant this personally and collectively. And that requires bringing in a broader spectrum of information, because it is the unconscious, the hidden information that turns us into automatons, that prevents us from making a conscious choice. So my one of the theses of this essay was that things are being brought to light that were invisible to us before, and that can therefore become the foundation of of greater sovereignty in our choosing our future.
Okay, so we've got some. Thanks for that, Charles. We've got Leo with us as well. Leo, do you want to? I'm not sure if we can get your video on. Oh, there you are. Beautiful. There he is.
Hey team.
Hey Leo, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah. Sweet. Yeah. Well, one of the things that I was sort of sitting on and you touched on it there briefly, was this kind of epistemological sort of crisis that we're in, and the polarization that has occurred. And Charles has named it. He said that we don't have a climate crisis, we have a crisis of polarization, and that's something that I see so prevalent. And it's almost, yeah, it's paralyzing the conversation because people aren't able to really meet in the middle. And here in Aotearoa, there's a really strong focus on unity in Te Reo Māori, ko tahitanga, which is kind of like being able to act as one. And this polarization is just stifling that. And I suppose there's sort of two questions, and one sort of leads into the other. One is, what role does knowledge have as science starts to, the cracks in science start to show as not being like the full picture, and how does that relate to indigeneity? And then how can we use this more holistic vision of knowledge to create kotahitanga, to bring people together and move forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So partly the polarization is happening because people are clinging desperately to systems of meaning. For many people, reality is kind of falling apart. Things that had seemed certain and reliable.
I think we lost Charles for a second there. Leo?
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
I can hear you guys.
Yeah, you're back on. Yep.
Okay. So maybe I'll backtrack a bit. So part of what's happening with polarization is that people are desperately clinging to narratives that invest the world with meaning. There was a banging downstairs and child's laughter, so everything's fine. Yeah, clinging to narratives that invest the world with meaning as our sense-making begins to waver and reality itself seems to be falling apart for so many people. Things that had seemed permanent and real and reliable being revealed as temporary and fragile and impermanent. And it brings people into a very uncomfortable place of not knowing, of crisis. And one way to stave off the uncertainty is to identify strongly with a narration of current events or a narration of the world that tells you what's happening, who you are, and what's gone wrong and what to do about it. So these narratives become more compelling as we enter greater and greater uncertainty. So I would say that they are a stage. Ultimately, reality invades these narratives and they become unreliable themselves, and people are launched into the real initiation of not knowing. And that is the only place that unity can come from. It will not and cannot come from one of the polarized sides defeating the other side in pitched battle, in political struggle or debate. Because as I was saying before, the conversation itself, the debate itself is excluding the data points, excluding the information that will allow us to come into coherency around a new story. That is what it is. Human beings are fundamentally story-making animals. That's how we create together. If you want to create anything beyond the power of your own two hands, you have to enroll other people in a story of what is to be and a story of why it is to be and the roles that that story assigns to them. Who are you to be in this collective endeavor? When a people has a compelling, robust story of the people, of who you are and why you're here and who we are, then coherent action and unity is possible. Indigenous cultures had this kind of story of the people, and in many cases still have this story of the people. However, the impact of market economies and modern science and technology and education and so forth has seriously challenged and disrupted these older mythologies. And so, and the dominant mythology of civilization is also disintegrating. What we have done to other cultures is now happening to ourselves. So Leo mentioned science. I mean, that is a core part of our mythology that 50 years ago, anyone with my degree of education would uncritically accept that science basically had the answers, that it encompassed all of reality in its explanatory power, that maybe there's still some pieces left that we haven't fully mastered yet, but generally we know what truth is and how to get there through the scientific method. And the metaphysical assumptions of science were unquestioned. Observer independence, objective reality, the amenability of all phenomena to quantification. The world is number. The force-based causality, like all of these things were part of the firmament of science. And anything that was not explainable by science or that contradicted its teachings would be, considered fantasy. That's no longer true. And I'm not the only one who has personally experienced things that my scientific education says are impossible. Says that there must have been hoaxes or hallucinations or something. Many people are experiencing these things, and even if they don't consciously say, well, science is incomplete, like underneath, like our faith and confidence in science is wavering, especially because it hasn't brought the paradise we were supposed to have had, like by the year 2000, the technological paradise. So none of this has happened. So again, what has happened to other cultures with the impact of Western civilization is now happening to Western civilization, which is a global civilization at this point itself. And that breakdown is in fact necessary for a bigger reality to come in to our view, upon which we can construct new stories, new mythologies to give coherence and meaning to our civilization as a collective.
An initiation could, I think I got muted. Love to dial down on these rites of passage that we're seemingly going to create for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's really something beyond what we can create for ourselves. It is a popular thing now to create rites of passage for youth. We're recognizing the need, the loss of that in our society and the need for it. And these are valiant attempts. It's hard really to have a rite of passage if there's not a community that holds it and recognizes it. Mm. So, you can't just have like some weekend thing and call it a rite of passage. Collectively, I do think we are going through a rite of passage where, like a real rite of passage, there is a mortal injury to your identity. You don't come out of it the same person you were when you went into it. Some dearly held belief about yourself is let go of, or a belief about the world. Who you are changes. And I think that it's fair to say that our civilization, our collective, is going through that. We're going through that process right now. It's not an easy thing. And there's no guarantee we'll get through it, actually. In many traditional societies, not everybody survived a rite of passage. It was for real. There was no indemnification waiver that you signed beforehand. There was no insurance.
Thanks, Charles.
Thanks, Leo. Thanks, Charles. I mean, one of the things for me that is live in a lot of conversations with people is, and I really feel this. Like I really feel this time, and I feel like a lot of us do in different ways. Regardless of our perspective, I really feel that there is a sense of a greater potential, of a greater change that's here with us at this time. I think, well, I mean, without getting too intellectual with this question, I mean, one of the things that is very much in front and center in the conversations that I'm in is that I mean, and hearing you mention this conversation around science and science being not really that trusted anymore, or accepted as showing us the truth. And I mean, the question I have is it really science that's the questionable, that's in question? Like, is it really? Because I think about the time when, for example, everyone thought the sun revolves around the earth, right? Like, there are certain scientific truths that just seem like far out. I mean, I can imagine, like, back then, I think Galileo was, or was it Copernicus? I can't remember what their respective discoveries were, but I'm pretty sure they got persecuted and taken to trial, and like, just, it was just that the idea was so far out that no one would even entertain it. Putting information out about this was seen as being something that was dangerous. And you know, and there is a lot of that narrative that there is a lot of criticism of different narratives and how dangerous they are right now, of that are coming out. So, but then over time, like, that actually ended up revealing itself to be, I mean, I don't know if that's something you could call truth.
Yeah.
That is the case. Like, that is a scientific discovery that, so I guess I'm just, for myself, I'm questioning whether it's actually science, because science is the same level. Like, when you're mentioning these supernatural, or I mean, I kind of think of a time that, yes, science could probably explain that as well. So
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I can respond to that. I think first, I'd like to distinguish between science as an institution and as a culture, and science as a method of inquiry. So on the one hand, you have official science, you have scientific consensus, you have the body of published literature. And on the other hand, you have the scientific method. So one question is, does the institution of science scrupulously adhere to the spirit and practice of the scientific method? Part of the crisis in science is that, and this is coming from critics on the inside, is that science has been captured by financial interests, has become captive of a kind of collective confirmation bias, publishing bias, funding bias that excludes dissenting viewpoints, promotion bias even, that prevents inquiry into unorthodox theories, that kind of protects its own paradigms, and that it's become dysfunctional. So that's one critique of science. That's not 100%. It's not, you know, I don't want to exaggerate that critique, but there are many within science who are concerned about the soundness of these key systems of, you know, funding and publishing and the way academia works and so forth. So, like to take an example I raised before, herbal medicine. There's not nearly as much funding for herbal therapies for, say, COVID-19 than there is for pharmaceutical therapies. Why? Well, for one thing, you cannot patent an herbal therapy. There's not that much money to be made from it. So in a time when most medical research is funded by pharmaceutical companies and by government organizations that themselves are heavily influenced by pharmaceutical companies, there's just not going to be that much funding. And imagine that if you're like a grad student and you can either join this prestigious project that's getting lots of funding and offers publication opportunities, or you can go off and try to gather the resources to do a clinical trial of some herbal protocol and probably never get published and have your work exposed to hostile scrutiny. Like, what are you going to do? So this is not to say that science is wrong. It's to say that it is not immune from the economic and psychological dysfunctions of the culture that embeds it. So that's one thing. And over time, this means that entire realms of phenomena are off limits to scientific inquiry. And I'm not saying that they're all true. And I'm not saying that every dissenting theory is true. They can't all be true. They contradict each other. But if they are not true, if they were true, it would be hard for us ever to know it because they're not subjected to scientific inquiry. So that's one thing. On another level, I could address the scientific method itself and its limitations, its strengths and its limitations. But I do think that might be getting like way too philosophical. And I treated it a bit in my climate book, actually. So those who are interested on a more of a intellectual philosophical dive into that topic can go there. Science at its core is about humility. The true scientist says, I don't know, so I shall ask. That's what an experiment is. And I think that science has, like other religions, has departed from its core essence and kind of become the opposite, become very arrogant. And it does operate very much like a religion. It treats its heretics the same way that Copernicus and Galileo got treated. They get excommunicated, i.e. denied funding. They get pilloried in social media. They get persecuted in all kinds of ways. It's not that different, actually. Human beings, we're still the same as we always were.
That differentiation just makes a world of brings a lot of insight for me in terms of what you mentioned about the institutional aspect of it, and it seems as though that's become even more and more ingrained in the culture of how science is practiced, that it is really now more political than it probably was before in the past. So we have a question from Gisele. Considering that the human race is heading to a dead road as a consequence of our own actions, what would be your views on human potential in our current circumstances? And that also touches something that I had in my mind of like, what really inspires you right now? What really lights you up in terms of, what you're taking in?
Yeah. So the dead end that we're hitting is basically showing us the limitations of the particular gifts that we have developed as a civilization, showing us the limitations of control-based technology, showing us the limitations of quantitative reasoning, of linear thinking, of maybe even of the scientific method, did I mention control-based technology? I think I did. that whole way of engaging the world is tremendously powerful. And it definitely, like all of our gifts, it definitely has its use. And there are many human capacities that have been left out of that civilizational trajectory that are necessary now for us to overcome the problems that face us. For example, I've mentioned this before, the autoimmunity epidemic. You can't find a pathogen and control it. It's about the environment. It's about the whole being, including the microbial ecology of the human being, including our psychology and our spirituality. Like it requires other kinds of technologies that aren't about exerting more and more precise force over something, like genetic engineering, and we're going to send nanobots in there to, no, it requires holistic thinking. Same thing is true about healing our global ecosystem. This is not about setting up carbon sucking machines in every city to draw down carbon. This is about healing the living organism of Gaia, restoring and regenerating and protecting its sacred places, its soil, its forests, its wetlands, and so on. Same thing is true about our social problems. This isn't about finding the right people to lock up or to punish, but to move beyond punishment, to understand where does antisocial behavior, whether it's crime or racism or misogyny, where does it come from? What is the ground from which it springs, and how do we address those conditions? That's also holistic thinking. It involves capacities of the human being that are only possible when we understand that we are not the only intelligence here in the world, but that we can access other intelligences and maybe the intelligence of the world itself. So these are what excite me today, because the possibilities that unfold from embracing these other ways of knowing and these other ways of thinking, holistic and interrelational with other beings, like what is possible from those makes all of our problems trivial to solve. Just to take a relatively tame example, permaculture and regenerative agriculture could easily feed the world and restore ecosystems everywhere with an investment of maybe 10% of the global military budget. It's not technically difficult. All of the knowledge is there. And I could say the same thing about restorative justice and restorative circles and truth and reconciliation committees and things like that to heal the social and political trauma that is unfolded. I mean, the same thing with some of the alternative and holistic health modalities that I've seen many times cure supposedly incurable diseases. I mean, this is a metaphor for our entire situation. And really where we are going is, I mean, when I mentioned a new unifying story for humanity that says, why are we here? It is to rejoin life in the purpose of life, which is to make the world more alive. And that starts with healing the damage that has been done in the course of developing our certain of our human gifts. And it doesn't stop there. Ultimately, it is a society that is dedicated to life and to beauty and to participation in the endless unfolding of wonders in this cosmos. That is the story that I think needs to replace the story of conquest and domination.
Great stuff. Okay, we'll take one more question. We're almost out of time. we have someone else with us in the webinar, Itai. Itai, your mic's muted, and we don't have your video either. Oh, yeah, great.
Here we go. Hi, Charles. Really inspiring to hear you. We have a mutual friend back in the States, Cynthia Jer. My partner and I, we are stewarding an Earth treasure vase here on Aotearoa, New Zealand. And actually, my question was exactly about what you were just talking about, like treating Earth as a living being and how that can take us forward. But you already answered it. So, like, my question is, how as individual, what is like you think that like our action that we can do, like the small person that doesn't have the resources, but just want to do to make like a step, and as well like the part of this what's called sacred activism that I heard you talking about in the past. As a stepping stone to go forward.
Yeah. Okay. So for one thing, like I can't tell people in general what step they should take because I think that step is unique to every person. But what it comes from, how do you recognize what that step is for you? It comes from standing in the perception that I just named, which is, why we are here. We are here to serve life and serve beauty and serve this earth. Once you inhabit that, then many, many steps become obvious to you. And one of the obstacles to seeing those steps is the theory of change that our civilization has bestowed upon us, which says change happens when you exert a force on the world, when you make something happen. Because it doesn't just happen. You have to make it happen. You have to push against the mass or the mass won't move. I mean, this is Galilean physics and Newtonian physics. And that theory of change invalidates, well, pretty much, what every indigenous culture has done and believed. And it invalidates the earth treasure vases, which I don't know if people listening know what those are, but they're a Tibetan technology, basically, that was transmitted to Cynthia Jewers, who's a Tibetan Buddhism teacher and actually an ordained Lama. And basically, they make these clay vessels and imbue them with all kinds of prayers in this big ritual. They work relics from deceased saints into the clay. And then you take them and you bury them with prayers in places of the earth, either power points or places of the earth that have seen trouble, that have seen trauma. And she was taught this technology by a 106-year-old Lama who said, this will have a powerful effect everywhere where you plant these vases. And her skeptical mind was like, what good is that going to do? We're talking real political and social hardship and trauma in these places. What good is it going to do to go bury this vase? But eventually she did it, and all kinds of miracles happened around it. Peace huts were established. And anyway, it's a very long story, but I'll just say that I'm not saying do that instead of political action, but I'm saying expand your horizon to include as valid anything that your heart calls you to do from the place of devotion and reverence to life and beauty on earth. Anything that comes from your devotion to life and beauty on earth will help in ways that your mind may or may not understand. That's how to recognize the next step.
That's such a beautiful place to finish. Thank you. Yeah, I've really enjoyed having you here, and I'm sure our viewers have too. And we look forward to continuing to follow your work and your movements. Hopefully they'll open up sometime soon, and we'll see you down here in Aotearoa, New Zealand again.
Yeah, well, thank you for your generous hosting of this conversation. I appreciate it.
Kia kaha, Charles. Stay strong. Ka kite.
Thanks. Kia ora.
Bye-bye.